Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome back to How I Write. And this time I'm so happy. Well, I'm always happy, but I'm exceptionally happy today to be welcoming my dear friend, Muneera Pilgrim, who, when we first founded the Muslim Writers Salon, Nafisa and we were thinking about all the people we wanted to interview, Muneera was right up there at the top of my list. And I was like, I'm going to get her. And it's taken me a year to pin her down. We were just saying it is actually a love language to keep pursuing the person that you want to interview. I mean, yeah, up to a point. But anyway, so welcome. Assalamu alaikum, Muneera. How are you doing?
Wa alaikum assalam. I am here and I am glad. And even though like you have been pursuing me, that I 100% want to do more work with you guys. I don't know if you'll have me, but 100%. If you have to pursue me all the time to get to this point, then some people may just give up, but it's fine. It's okay. I'm okay with that. It's okay.
No, it's good. It makes it, you're in demand. It actually, I have heard that employers like people who are really, really, occupied and busy. It makes you look like more desirable. But anyway, that's beside the point. So I'm just going to give a very brief bio for anybody who hasn't come across Muneera's work before, which would be crazy to me, especially if you're in the UK and you're Muslim. But anyway, so Muneera is an international poet, cultural producer, writer, broadcaster, and TEDx speaker who co-founded the Muslim hip-hop and spoken word duo Poetic Pilgrimage with our other OG, Sakina, and is the author of the 2021 collection, That Day She'll Proclaim Her Chronicles. She conducts workshops, lectures, contributes regularly to BBC Two's Pause for Thought, and is a community artist researcher with an IBT. I'll ask you more about this in a bit later. A mental health development worker and an alumni associate artist with the English Touring Theatre, where she's working on her first play. I think this may be out of date. I think your play actually already came out. But again, I'm going to come to this in a little while. And as a freelance writer, Muneera has written for The Guardian, Amaliah, Huffington Post, The Independent, Jazeera Blog, Black Ballard, and various other digital and print platforms. She's been featured across the BBC network. Sorry, my son is crashing the door behind me. She's been featured across the BBC network, including BBC News, as well as Sky News, Sky Arts, Al Jazeera, and various other television channels. In 2015, a documentary about her former group, Poetic Pilgrimage, was commissioned by Al Jazeera Hip Hop Hijabis and has been screened several times since. The link to watch that is in the event description on our Circle platform. Muneera holds an MA in Islamic Studies, where she focused on Black British pathways to spirituality, migration, gender, and race. She holds a second MA in Women's Studies, a little bit of an overachiever here, but I'm just amazing, mashallah, where she focused on the intersection of faith and spirituality, race, gender, autoethnography, and methodologies of empowerment for non-centered people. Her innovation in her work won her the Anne Kolosky-Naylor Award for Adventurous Academic Writing. So, mashallah, just an amazing list of things that you've already achieved, and no doubt there's so much more happening right now and in the future, inshallah. So before we jump in, in fact, I just want to ask what I always ask writers, because it's always the uppermost question in my mind. What was that moment when you realized that you were a writer? What is it that inspired you to write?
Oh, wow. That is a interesting question for so many reasons. I think I realized that I was, even that is, yeah, I was going to say, I think I realized I was a poet before I realized I was a writer. But I think it's more accurate to say I realized I had written a poem before I realized I was a poet, and then before I realized I was a writer. The time that I realized I had written a poem was very clear for me. Essentially, I was born in Bristol. Bristol is a city in the southwest of England, for those of you who don't know, or if you're from London and you think Bristol is up north, no, it's in the southwest of England. And Bristol has a rich history of culture, of so many different things, right? So many different music genre forms have come out of England. Bristol was very notorious and famous for sound systems, Jamaican reggae sound systems. For example, there was a famous club called the Bamboo Club, where, the Beatles, reggae artists from around the world will come to visit. So Bristol has a lot of culture. With that, it's also important to say that still now Bristol is seen as one of the most segregated cities I think it's the most segregated core city, and one of the 7 most segregated cities in the country. And that is based on all lines. That is based on race, that is based on age, that is based on class, so many various different things which still affect Bristol to make it so segregated. But thinking back when I was growing up, or before I was growing up, in England, or we have the race relation legislation, which protects people based on race, and we also have the Equalities Act, right, which protects all protected characteristics. But that came into being as a result of a boycott which happened in Bristol. So prior to this boycott happening in Bristol, there were no forms of safety nets in the country. Also, the Bristol riots was, or I call them uprisings, was something where we saw riot police for the first time using some of the armor that they use when they're dealing with the riots. And essentially, I say all of that to say that there was a lot of tensions, particularly in regards to race in Bristol. So thinking about the bus boycott that was in the 60s, thinking about the riots that was in the 80s. I was born in the 80s, but raised in the 80s and the 90s. So one evening I went to my mom and I was like, Mom, tomorrow there's a fair happening and I would really like to go. So every year, maybe, I think it was like a fair would come to Bristol. So, I don't know if you know about fairs, but they travel to different cities, basically. It's normally some form of traveling community that will bring the fair to Bristol, and I really want to go. My mum was like, yeah, sure thing. You can definitely go. That day came, I was like, Mom, I'm going to the fair. She was like, what fair? You're not going no fair? What fair? I was like, the fair we talked about yesterday. And my mum was like, no, you ain't going. However, I don't know what divine insight, I don't know what prayers she was saying that gave her that insight, or whatever it was. But essentially at that day when many of my friends went to the fair, there was a young man by the name of Marlon Thomas. He had a white girlfriend, black boy had a white girlfriend. Fairground workers didn't like this. And then they started bullying him and bullying the girl. And then it just turned into a big brawl, apart from the young people who were really, some of them pre-teens into teens, had nothing because they was intending to go on rides, right? Whereas they had baseball bats, knuckle dusters, chains, all sorts of things. And so Marlon Thomas was attacked, right? All of them were attacked, really, but Marlon felt the brunt of it, and he got beaten up so badly that he had to be resuscitated. And there were several attempts. The final attempt to, he was resuscitated eventually, but his life is completely different. He can't eat, he can't speak, he can't do anything for himself. His family have had to band round. That has been a moment of trauma within Bristol, and a moment of trauma for these young people, particularly young Black boys who experience this. And I remember going into school, and in my school, just trying to really talk about this, or trying to think about this. How do we deal with this heavy thing that has happened to our friends, to strangers, or to whoever, to all of these people? But we know for the first time what racism is. I heard that people did things, I think I remember a few years before was the LA riots, right? So all of these things were I knew it happened, but I didn't think it happened in Bristol. And then just to realize that someone's life could be so fragile. And I remember writing a poem. And so I wrote a poem, and I was like, that was the moment I was like, oh, this is a poem. This is a piece of poem. It conveys a message. It has an emotion. It reaches people. It touches people. It gives some comfort to people. It is a form of documentation, because in my school, all of a sudden, after about 2 weeks of us as young kids not being able to deal with it, I think I was like year 11. I was quite young, right? And then it was like, yeah, you're not allowed to talk about this anymore. And so I think it was at a time that they were like, you're not allowed to talk about this, that I discovered writing poetry, and I realized that this was something that could be conveyed. And that's how I started writing poetry. And then I guess just performing it made me feel like a poet. But it was probably many years later that I actually felt like a poet. And probably I'm still coming into my, what does it mean to be a poet? When I started writing other things, you know, like writing essays, or people commission me to do to write articles and things like that. And I think even though there's pros and cons with BBC, and I have is a real kind of source of contention for me, I think that definitely helped me to become a better writer, because I did have, even whether I agreed with what they said or not, because sometimes a lot of it wasn't really necessarily about the technique. Oftentimes it was about the content, or oftentimes it was about how do you make your personality smaller? How do you minimize your blackness or your Muslimness or your womanness, or the way they interweave, right? But I would say writing consistently for BBC Radio 2 has made me a better writer. And I definitely am a writer because I spend a lot of time doing it. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, you guys can see how beautifully Muneera is expressing herself. So I think the natural next question is, how did you come into speaking and spoken word poetry? And how do those two, well, multiple kind of feathers in your hat, how do they all coexist? And how do they like interrelate, the written poetry, the speaking, theater making? And particularly I'm thinking about the spoken word poetry, because that's kind of how I got to know you as a spoken word poet.
Mm. It's so interesting being interviewed, isn't it? Like in your head, you know your answers, and in your head, you know the questions that people are gonna ask. And then people ask questions and you're like, I don't know. But let me think about this. So I'm so sorry. Could you ask the question
I'll reframe
again?
it, because that was a bit of a rambly question
Not at
anyway.
all.
Yeah, so from initially writing that first poem as a kind of an urgent act of like protest and probably like healing as well, what led you into spoken word poetry particularly?
Yeah. Okay. Well, so growing up, first of all, I say that I realized it was a poem. And I say that more specifically rather than I realized I was a poet, because I realized this was a piece of work that did something. It was almost like a technology that had a place in the world, and it does something, right? But I didn't really think about my identity in all of that. And throughout my life, not knowing and not having a strong hold of what is my identity, who am I, where am I from, what does it mean to be me, has been something that has stayed with me. I've always felt like an outsider to an extent. And it's funny because I work with a lot of young people, and I see young people and I say to myself, like, you are going through struggle now, but you don't realize who you are is the blessing about you, is actually the thing that is going to make people want to radiate and come close to you, and is going to give you life, right? And I spent a lot of my childhood and even adult into young adults. It's fair to say that as a young person, I had in England, we call them ACEs, which is adverse childhood experiences. So there's this idea that if you go through particular traumas, right, that like you are a child who's going to need support. And so I think it's fair to say that I had some adverse childhood experiences. And it's also fair to say that I found it hard to be in groups and to fit in and to, and that took me I had to articulate who I am to myself all the time. I had to think about, who am I? Why don't I fit in? I had to always ask myself these questions. And I think sometimes it could lead to being self-critical, but also it's very good to be able to ask yourself, what do I believe in? Who am I? Why do I think I'm not fitting in here? Why can't I go there? So these have always been questions. I've always had like multiple voices in my head asking these questions, right? And so then there became other questions. So the idea of beauty, right? So if I, as a child, am ugly, why am I ugly? What makes me ugly in comparison to other people? Is it my race? Is it complexion? Is it my weight? Is it all of these various different things? Okay, so then who said this? Who set these standards? So these were constantly questions that were being raised, and I was compelled to answer the questions. So I think in answering those questions and answering why the questions about society and how do I fit in, that led me into speaking a little bit. People, elders wanting to call on me to do various different projects. I say later, at the age of 14, I started on pirate radio station and I started hosting shows. Then Bristol went through this kind of wave of trying to get a Black station legally. So they had these one-off sort of like legal stations that will be there for about a month or so. So I started doing a lot of that, and that led into me finding out more about music. I started DJing a bit, finding out more about words, having a relationship with words, listening to rappers like Tribe Called Quest, rappers like Ty, rappers like Nas, all of these kind of, like kind of late 90s rappers, and like really thinking about how did you put these words together and what are you talking about? I remember when I heard the Black Star album, Mos Def and Talib Kweli, and I was just in shock. I was stunned. I was hearing words that I've never heard, words that I had to go into a dictionary, words that fit together so smoothly. And this is, I guess, what I could really was a part of my journey. And also my parents, not so much my dad. My dad's a very quiet Jamaican man, conservative, quiet Jamaican man, but a lot of my family are they're storytellers, right? And also having being ADHD, dyslexic, all of these various different things, which I didn't find out until later on in life. Oral communication became a very important tool for me, and it became the way in which I was able to sell myself, essentially. Does that answer your question?
I don't care. It's just fascinating. I'm just mesmerized when you speak. And now I see the radio connection. It's yeah, I would have Radio Muneera playing nonstop. Because
well, I have a show. I'm back on radio. I have a show, so I'll send you the link.
Awesome. Oh, that's really exciting. Oh my gosh. Yeah, there's just so much there. Wow. I mean, any of those things I could pull on and I was going to go deeper into, but okay, so thinking it just in practical terms. So you went into radio and then that led into rap as well. Just in practical terms, how did you get onto a stage? Were there particular venues? Were there particular programs that you studied or particular mentors or people that helped you?
Yes. So in terms of my first stages, in terms of speaking, and okay, so radio, for example, I just used to call in all the time. My mum's phone bill was very high. I used to call in and I would just talk. I would talk to the DJs. They knew me. They would I'll get my name mentioned on radio all the time, which is really cheesy now, but they would call me up. And then one day they said that they were looking for female DJs. They were prepared to train them up. And I was like, I really want to do this. My parents were a bit apprehensive because I was so young. And my parents, I'm surprised that I was actually allowed to do it because my parents are very conservative Jamaican people, right? Jamaica is very, church, very church, Black church and all of its goodness, but also Black church and roots in slavery, right? So my gran, she was never like this to me, but one of her favorite sayings was what is it? It's from the Bible. I'm gonna mess it up. Dear God, I'm sorry I'm messing up your words. Spareth the rod, spoileth the child, or something like that. So it was a child should be seen and not heard, particularly back then, right? But my parents, someone's laughing. Yeah, that's my parents basically. Yeah. But my parents let me do it for some strange reason. They let me do it. And even the DJs, they were a little bit concerned because they was like, this girl is young. I guess what they was alluding to was safeguarding issues, right? But I guess there was no, okay, someone saying that their grandma is from Trinidad. Okay, so you get the sentiments basically. But they let me do it and the radio station let me do it. That kind of gave me a bit of a platform. So in that platform, that led me to do it, like presenting shows, presenting like talent shows in Bristol and things like that. In terms of poetry, I don't think my poetry career at that time started really until I moved from Bristol to London. So myself and Sakina, who I used to be in a group with, we were both in Bristol. We used to spend a lot of time together listening to music, thinking about the meaning of life. Like what we were the odd buds in any friendship group, right? And then we moved to London, and then we talked about before about should we do something together, because she was she still is a remarkable singer, and I used to write a lot. And then we was like, yeah, when we move to London, we'll form a group. And then we formed a group, and at that time, Sakina's boyfriend, this is before Islam, Sakina's boyfriend was a rapper. So we used to just follow them about. And then it was kind of like, well, we can do this. And then we just started going to cultural days. Then we started going to open mic nights. And the scene at that time in London was oh so beautiful. It was just very supportive and very, people were just really happy to see us. So I think I would say if anyone's looking for things to do, and I know things are totally different in each country, each city, even each area is very, very different. But when I came back to Bristol, for example, I just did a lot of open mic nights. I was like, okay, I'm gonna go back onto the open mic scene, or onto the open mic scene, because that was the first time I was seeing the open mic scene in Bristol. Sometimes it was a bit strange because Bristol's like a bit of a strange city. So sometimes I would like, okay, we'll say poetry open mic, and then there will be a comedian holding a cat or something, like telling a story about him and his cat. It was strange, but yeah, just get out there, whatever platforms there are, is what I would say.
Awesome. That is really beautiful, and also alludes to, I was going to ask also what kind of advice you have, but let's come to that in a minute, because there's a couple of things I want to ask. What is it that makes you want to write a poem? What gets you excited about going, oh, that's a poem, I can feel it bubbling? Like, how does it work for you?
I feel it in my fingers, I feel it in my toes. Okay, so it could be various different things. It could be, a lot of the times, there's injustice, right? And even if the poem that I write isn't a poem about injustice, the root of it will be injustice. So a lot of the time is injustice. A lot of the time it is conversations, it is lines in a book, it is conversations with friends, conversations with strangers, a film. It is really just partaking in life. And for me, and I'm sure like some of you may hold this opinion, I don't want to make any assumptions, but like oftentimes the writing is the smallest part of the actual job. And that's not to say that writing is small, or that you are not going to write loads. But to get from idea to poem, there's so many various different stages. And I think one of the beauties, one of the benefits, one of the blessings about being a poet is that you can be a poet in life, right? It's not so much about what you write, is about how you engage with life, how you partake in life, how you see the world in which we're living in, how you try to seek God in life, how you reflect on yourself. And so I spend a lot of time, and maybe some of that comes from my childhood, and maybe some of that comes from being the odd one out or being in awkward spaces, and not, I ask myself a lot of questions about myself, but also about the world around me. Like, what does that mean? To the point that sometimes I get on my friends' nerves, right? Because I'll be like, well, what did you mean by that? But what exactly did that mean? Well, so sometimes it could be a bit irritating, but I think just having that real time to engage with with the world, and having an appreciation of the world, and having an appreciation of people generally, and then seeing a spark. But it is from conversations, it is from having these conversations, it is from seeing what is happening in the world, it is from witnessing the world. And then I think I go into a sort of period where sometimes I just hear things, or just witness like something outside my window, and I just write it down. And that can stay with me for months. That could literally stay with me for months. And then I've realized all of a sudden I've got a collection of these little thoughts and these little feelings, and I try to weave them together. That is probably the ideal poem. That's probably the ideal poem that makes me feel comfortable, that doesn't really push me out of my comfort zone. That would be the start of an ideal poem. But then there's the thing about, because I am just coming out of a period of not really writing that much since releasing my publication, my book, my collection, that She'll Proclaim Her Chronicles. I've just felt like I can't write. I felt like the tap was dry. I was like, there's no more words that's going to come out of me. Like, how am I a poet? What is this? I can't be a poet. And am I going to be performing these same poems for 17,000 years? Because I couldn't write. I couldn't write. And so I went on this journey. And even in the process of writing that collection, and I thank someone by the name of Jacob Samler Rose. I think if you think about Britain, if you think about so many poets, if you look at their trajectories, so many roots lead back to this man in some way, shape, or form. And the Pearls of Islam are actually related to him as well. So I think, how blessed is this family where they could have so many great people. But Jacob Samler Rose really, really helped me and pushed me and put me in positions that are uncomfortable. Even now, I'm avoiding his phone calls because he told me to do something and I'm scared to do it. But yeah, he has given me many techniques, like, for example, just writing a life, like a timeline of my life, right? Writing a timeline of my life. And I think he got it from somewhere. I don't remember the name of the book that he got it from, but then putting those things into categories of like highs and lows, and then writing about those highs and lows. What was high about it? What was low about it? Or was it like just a average? Is there no high or no low? But writing about those things, that stimulates poems as well. Sometimes I just try to write poems about buildings, because I've noticed in my poetry a lot of the time I speak from a perspective of I, even if I'm not speaking about myself. So I try to write from the perspective of other people. What does it look like? So, and then also just free writing, just going through a lot of free writes. But those are, and commissions, of course. If I'm commissioned, that's a totally different process. And in this whole time of, well, let's say not whole time, but like, because we know there's always things happening in Palestine, there's always things happening in Sudan. But like recently I've been writing more and more poetry, and I'm noticing that there's a difference between my protest poetry, and the other poetry that I write. And it's all welcome, and it's all beautiful. It's all welcome, it's different ways. But I think my comfort zone is probably, oh, something came to me, or I heard something, let it ingest, and then a few months later, finally a poem will emerge.
Mashallah, I love also how you differentiate between the poem that's easy to write and the poem that's kind of in your comfort zone and like a pleasure to write. And then there's the poem that's like maybe preying on you a little bit, like, oh, I really don't want to write this, or it's just, yeah, pushing you out of your comfort zone. Do you have any habits when you write? Like, what do you write in? Do you type? Do you write into your phone? Do you use transcription? I'm sorry, my son, a child came into my house. I don't quite know how, and they're making. Can you keep it down? Por favor. Who is it? Oh, hi. Okay, guys, but just keep it down a little bit. Something we need to see, please. Be gone. Rarely. Okay, sorry about that. What was I talking about? Yeah, do you have any, like, what's your favorite way to write, or how do you typically write? Is it like you wake up in the middle of the night inspired and you have to run, like, dash off some lines, or how does it normally happen?
Well, I would say that all of those things. So like sometimes it is, oh, I've got to write, stop everything now, don't even talk to me, I've got to write something. But it wouldn't be a poem, right? Normally those things aren't a poem. If I was to wake up in the middle of the night, that will probably be something that looks like the first draft of a poem. But I think there's so many different ways in which I write. All I try to do, in terms of writing, a habit, the only thing that I try to say to myself nowadays, and I am struggling with this, is write every day. Just write every day. Even if it's a line, even if it's a sentence, even if it's rubbish, even if it's whatever it is, just try to write every day. And it's not easy. And I struggle, and but I definitely try. And I think there is something, going back to you being persistent, there is something about I think about when I first converted to Islam, right? And when I first converted to Islam, I remember trying to learn how to pray. Just trying to learn how to pray, trying to learn how to say the words, trying to learn how to just do all of these different things. And there was something about that struggle. There was something about that sort of like tension that made it feel fresh, that made it feel like, okay, there was something about that lack of ease. And it wasn't putting myself at a real disposition, but there was something about that lack of ease that gave me, it made me want to hold on more to it. I was thinking the other day, wow, like imagine that I was able to keep that sort of zeal, and I would probably be very tired. In fact, I am very tired generally most days, lack of iron. But imagine being able to hold on to that. And I think there is something about being persistent with something. And so I don't by any stretch of the imagination find writing that easy. Do you know what I mean? I'm just compelled to do it. I just have to do it. It's just in me. I know that I'm a writer, but like just being persistent and it's like, okay, so you missed out a week. Okay, you got to start again. Okay, you missed a day out. Okay, so you wrote quite a bit today, or you wrote 3 poems, or you wrote, so I think it is about just being persistent and doing it, trying to do it every single day. And even if it's not poetry, even if it's not, even if it's a different form of writing, because I do think whatever I'm writing at the moment, whether it's an article, whether it's a story, whatever it may be, there is generally a link between it and some connection between it. So, and also just realizing that oftentimes for myself, a lot of what I write is not going to see the light of day. Do you know what I mean? It's not going to see the light of day. And sometimes in order for you to get like a 3-line poem, you probably have to write 5 pages. And sometimes it comes easier, so I think it's really different, but really just being consistent and actually writing again for radio too, because that was on what I do them in sort of bursts, right? So when I'm doing that on a weekly basis, and just having to think faster and trying to gather stories faster. I think that has really helped. And that is my habit essentially.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And it's funny because this month we've been focusing a lot about resistance, and like resistance in the sense, first of all, of what kind of resistance do we have inwardly that sort of like hinders us, prevents us from like doing whatever it is that we really want to do. Like it can be all kinds of things. It can be writing, or it could be exercising, or it could be all kinds of things, getting up for tahajjud, it could be all kinds of things. And I think what I've noticed is it can show up in so many different ways. Like sometimes it's self-doubt. It's like, oh, what's the point? Nobody's gonna be interested in this anyway. Or it can be like, I can't really face that right now, so I'm gonna get really busy doing a million other things. That was my usual go-to, is just like, I realized my procrastinations have procrastinations, like that project, I'll do this project, and then that gets too daunting, so I'll go and make another project to kind of avoid having to face the thing that I'm struggling with. But anyway, this isn't about me, but I wanted to ask you more about, you kind of answered it already, but yeah, like what do you feel is, let me try and formulate this as an actual question so I'm not just rambling. How does the resistance show up for you, and how do you flip it?
Well, one thing, because I'm looking in the chat and Warren asked a question about editing, and like, does that include editing? And one way in which resistance shows up for me in my writing is trying to resist the urge to edit. I try. Sometimes I find myself writing, right? And just editing every single line as I'm going on. And I'm like, no, allow time for it to breathe, first of all. Allow time for your thoughts to be formed. And what does it look like when you take a step back and when you, as a poet, particularly as someone who performs their poetry, right? I think particularly for people of color, right, in a British environment, essentially you have like, how can I put it? Spoken words, poetry is seen as sexy, it's seen as exciting, it's seen as edgy, right? And so as a poet, you can you can sit down, write a poem on a Monday, edit it on the same Monday, practice it, and then by Wednesday or Thursday, be out at a poetry event performing your poem. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. However, I feel like if that is the only means in which I am writing a poem for me, that I am writing a poem, and that I've only have such a short relationship, I don't have time to think about what does that mean. I don't have space between it. I don't have time to have other thoughts to bring that to it. I don't have time to critique it. I don't have time, if I don't have time to go back and edit parts and be like, actually, I don't like that line. Oh, actually, I do like that line. Let me bring it back, right? Then for me, that's restricting my poetry, because there are those forms of poems that exist. But like, for example, I wrote a poem, and I don't regret this poem. I love this poem. I wrote this poem called Bear Witness, and it is based on what is happening in Gaza at the moment, right? And I was just thinking to myself, what does it mean to bear witness to something? And what does it mean to be a Muslim and to bear witness for something? And there were just images that kept coming up on my Instagram. And I was like, let me take some snapshots of these images, right? But if that was the only thing that I wrote about, and I wasn't developing a fuller body about what is happening, then you would think that the atrocities, and someone who didn't know what was happening read that poem, they would think that there were only a few atrocities that ended this day, that they wouldn't know much about how people are living, how people are breathing. They wouldn't know much about the other side of it. What does it mean? Like, I feel in many ways that like the people in Gaza and in Palestine generally are showing us how to love. They're showing us what does it mean to love each other? What does it mean to nurture each other, to support each other? What does community means? And sometimes if you write just from one perspective and you don't have other pieces of writing around it, or even in the same space so that you could write other aspects of it, then essentially in this case, we may only see people as victims, and inevitable victims at that. Do you get what I mean? So I think giving myself space is also really important. But Warren's got their hand up.
Yeah. Warren, do you want to unmute?
Assalamu alaikum, everyone.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Firstly, I really enjoyed this talk so far, Sister Muneera. So thank you. Yeah, it's been brilliant. No, just to build on that. So it was more to do with so for example, I'm working on a project, a book of poetry at the moment with Medina, and I'm doing teacher training. So I feel like where my headspace is, I feel like I've only got time to work on those edits. So it's more to do with like stuff where it's gone through the motions over like months, if not like a year or so. And that's what I was thinking about. Like sometimes in terms of energy, mental energy, I've only got enough to focus on what's already been written, kind of like, be scrupulous, chip away at it. But to write something new, like just out of the pan, I just find that like a real struggle. So that's why I asked like, what's your take on that, and how would you perceive that? You kind of answered it though, to be fair. Like you spoke about, almost like building a relationship with the poem, which I really liked. So I feel like maybe a gut check for myself is, is there a relationship with this poem? And if there is, then I can continue to like, get to know it a bit more and see what works, what doesn't work. It's a very poetic way to look at editing. So yeah, thank you. That's what I just wanted to mention.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I can't wait to read that collection.
I told him I'm going to show these poems to Muneera because I'd love to see your thoughts on them. But anyway, that's a little tangent. So inshallah, we will. Okay. Talking of which, this is a nice little segue. What makes a good poem, in your opinion?
Why are you asking me these questions? What makes a good poem? Maybe, and not all of the time, not exclusively, but maybe a poem that you're scared to share. Maybe a poem that you're scared to share. Maybe a poem And it doesn't have to be all of these things at the same time. And I'm saying all of these things, even though I'm just thinking it on the spot, but these things are things that come to mind, right? So maybe a poem that you're scared to share, maybe a poem that you don't know the answer to. Maybe a poem that comes from a perspective that you haven't heard, or a perspective, is that me? Is that me? A perspective that you haven't heard, or a perspective that you don't often write from, and a poem that connects with you, a poem that you feel proud of. And this may be the scariest one, but maybe a poem that people like, you know? And not everyone's going to like your poetry all of the time. And, you know, not everyone's going to like your poetry all the time, but sometimes I've read poems, I've been like, this poem is trash. I don't know what is bringing me to read this poem on this day in this place. And I read it and people love it. And I am thankful, right? Because there is this strange thing about your poems not being yours and your poems having a work. Your poems being, I used to think about poetry as a methodology and a lens in which to see the world. And I still do think that, but I'm thinking more and more about poetry as a technology and it being able to do something, right? What does poetry do? So I guess a poem that does something, whether it highlights something, whether it talks about something, whether it makes you feel warm or makes somebody else feel warm. But I think for myself, oftentimes, and again, I talk about my protest poetry because I think the poems that I write for protest or are more protesty are very different. But like, if I do think, if I know the answer to the poem, or if I know what I'm going to write about already, then maybe that poem needs to be challenged in some way, shape, or form. Even if it's not challenged in the words, challenged in the form, or I think form's a really good way to challenge poetry. And it's a way that I'm thinking about challenging myself and challenging my poetry. Last year, April, I joined a poetry course and I stuck for Allah, ya Allah. I'm not used to, I've always been like in my friendship groups, the girl who got the least money, right? And so I'm always nervous to pay for things. But I realize as well, some of that is my upbringing. I've moved back in with my parents since I moved to Bristol. And I'm realizing, actually, some of this isn't me. Some of this is just things that I've inherited. And when I say that my parents are conservative, that's in all ways: conservative with money, conservative with just the way they live their life, conservative with a lot of their attitudes, and not in a negative way, in a very sort of straight, honorable Jamaican way, right? But I never thought about spending money on myself, right? It felt, how dare I want to do something for myself? But I pushed myself last year to join a course, a poetry course by Obsidian Foundation. They are a group of poets, remarkable poets to add, in the UK, Black poets, and they do a course every year or every other year called Obsidian Foundation, and it is online, but it's a collection of poets from all around the world. So you know, and you get into groups and you write poetry and you are set different tasks. But just before, at one point we was having the conversations with Nick Mahoka, who is the he runs the Obsidian Foundation, and he was talking about the fact that, like he said, you are all so talented, right? You've had to cultivate talent. Talk about Black poets, generally speaking, but Black people, was like, you've had to cultivate talent. You've had to show how skilled you are. You've had to come with so many different skills, and you had to really sort of like show the world that you can, and sometimes do twice as well, 3 times as well, and all of these different things. But don't rely on just having the ability to whip something out the box, right? Or don't rely on the ability of knowing that you are skilled in particular ways. Challenge yourself. And then they set us a challenge of writing sonnets, because I don't often write in form, right? And then we learned about the history of sonnets coming from a sort of like Black perspective, and various different writers who use sonnets, and there was a whole sonnet movement. But just the idea of like, yeah, sometimes poetry, not all the time, but sometimes poetry comes easy to me, right? And I'm like, think I've got something great. Woohoo, I got this, right? But actually then challenge myself in the form. Or sometimes I may think I have a poem. Like I once wrote a poem. It was like this Obsidian Foundation as well. I wrote a poem, and the poem on the surface was about this dude who was trying to tell me, don't make jokes when you're performing. He was trying to say, basically, me and him were both performing. The audience loved me, and the audience didn't love him. But he was like, why are you pandering to the audience, this, that, and the other? And I was like, I'm not pandering to the audience. I just like communication. I like talking. And when I'm nervous, I like to make jokes as well. So like, it's not pandering to the audience. And I got really upset about this person who's not from my city, not from my community, coming in telling me how to be as a Black Muslim woman who recently around that time, I had like a hate attack, right? And you're telling me how to be in my body, and it didn't sit right with me. So I wrote a poem about it. And then it was a very good poem. All of the words were where the words need to be. All of the like alliteration, all of the this, the that, where everything was where it needed to be. And then he was like, that poem's not about that. What is that poem actually about? And then after he was like, I started talking about my body. And then he was like, asking me more and more questions about my body. And the truth came out was like, that I feel that my body's failing me, right? And then I talked about the fact that like, I feel very upset and very emotional and very saddened by the fact that like people try to control my body and I try to defend my body, and I have all of these issues. Like I'm oftentimes in pain, right? I have knee problems, back problems. Like, I'm oftentimes in pain. And also one thing that I really want is I really want to have a child, right? And I don't think I'm going to have a child. And this for me, I feel like in some ways that my body has betrayed me, right? Or I betrayed my body. I'm not sure which one. And so a poem that went from being about, this guy, who does he think he is? Do you know what I mean? To actually analyzing that and realizing, nah, this is a poem about my body. It's a poem about my relationship about my body, how my body is policed, and also about the fact that I feel guilty because I'm not sure if I've betrayed my body or if my body's betrayed me. But just to think, what is this poem actually about? What does it lead to, I think?
Wow, it sounds like a really therapeutic thing. And actually, I want to go back and just read the comment that Noor made earlier. Sorry, Noor, I didn't read it out at the time. I think words can be a healing source, especially when you grow up as a minority, because they can't steal your words like so much. And that is very powerful.
I'm going to write that down. Thank you so much.
Someone is asking how much was this course?
You know what? I don't know. I keep saying to people, I don't know if it's a lot or if it's not a lot. For me, it felt like it was a lot. It's £250. It's £250, which isn't a lot. It isn't a lot. But someone who's not, yeah. In the wrong month, that might be a lot of money. And also like just someone who's not used to spending on themselves, someone who's not used to buying anything for myself or buying anything for my development, that felt like a lot of money at the time.
Did you feel like it was a really good investment?
There was a lot of problematic things about it. Like, even as I said, when we got to the questioning about what is the poem actually really about, I didn't feel that triggered in that moment, but a lot of the people in my group, well, 2 other people in my group, it was quite small groups, felt triggered, right? And so they called me, and it was a lot of conversation about how do we deal with that, because I think so many people are dealing with different things, and you don't know what is going to trigger someone. So like, and I've heard that critique of that particular tutor. So every day you had a different tutor before, but I definitely would do it again. It was a phenomenal course, phenomenal teachers. I still speak to the collective on a regular basis. I still speak to the people in my group even more regularly. I now have people in Chicago, in Philadelphia, in Trinidad. Like, is wonderful. Is wonderful.
MashaAllah. Warren says that's half the price of a PS5. Priorities. Priorities. And Bartek comments as well. That's really powerful considering what am I really angry about? And I was just going to say the same, like that process of interrogating your poem, like such a thing of like putting a mirror up and interrogating yourself and your feelings. Like, what's the feeling behind the feeling? Like, Naomi Shihab Nye has a collection of poems called The Words Behind the Words. And I just love that expression. Well, it's like in a poem, you know, for me, like, again, going back to what we were talking about, like what makes a good poem, I feel like when I read a poem and I think that's a good poem, it's because I feel like there's depth. It feels like watered, you know, like it's like watered silk. Like there's a pattern there, but it's like, it's a subtle pattern and there's, it's a bit transparent. There's something behind it. And yeah, what a process to go through to really interrogate that and say, what am I really angry about? Like, and in that moment of just feeling like, screw him, you know, I can just make this really passionate poem and I'll feel really good about myself. But then what is there behind that? Like, how can I deepen that? And how can I push a bit more? And how can I push myself more? And I think that's why, you know, poetry, I don't know if it's more than any other form of writing, because I think all forms of writing can do this. Like novels can certainly do this as well. And like, you know, theater, I absolutely love theater, though I haven't, you know, been involved in it a very long time. But, you know, it's that thing of learning about yourself. It's a way to know yourself better.
Agreed.
Right? And that the writing process is that, but then the editing process, it takes it to this whole other level because you just go out of your comfort zone completely. Oh, I'm so sorry, Noor, you had your hand up, but I'll read out your comment. Never give up on having a child, even if you reach the age of 90 or beyond, because the Lord of the world answers dua, if not in this life, in the next. And the more you ask, certainly the more he will love you. Ameen.
Thank you. Ameen, 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 ameen. Okay, all of you guys gotta make dua for me to have a child. But
yes.
like I don't have a partner either, so that I guess has come
May Allah give you the most wonderful partner and a child and abundance and bliss in this life and the next.
Ameen, 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 ameen. For may all of our duas be answered and more, inshallah.
Ameen. There's so many other questions I want to ask you, but I know we're kind of running out of time a little bit. So I want to just ask, well, talk to us a little bit about getting your book out. And if you can read a poem for us, that would be amazing.
Yes, no doubt, no doubt, no doubt. So getting the book out, it is, I never thought I would have a book out. I didn't think a collection was for me. I wasn't writing towards a collection. I was just writing. I think there is this sort of division, this really unhealthy division between page poet and stage poet. And I feel like oftentimes when you think about who, certainly in the scenes that I was about, who people considered sort of stage poets, it was minority poets, right? So whether it's based on race, whether it's based on faith, whether it's based on class, whether it's based on, and then oftentimes you will have no trajectory for these poets, right? They perform. A lot of what they're performing is sort of fits in with what is trending in this sort of like mainstream thought, and then people just end up performing. Whereas I was finding a lot of my sort of like white middle class sort of counterparts were performing, writing poetry collections, doing poetry festivals, and then, you know, being a trustee, end up as a trustee with this organization, then working for universities and all sorts of things through their poetry, but that trajectory didn't seem to be. And I guess like I sometimes, one of the things that I pray for and I ask Allah about a lot is to realize the opportunity when I'm in the opportunity, to realize the opportunity and beyond the opportunity. Because all right, I have a friend called Lee Cam. When we were kids, through DJing, we got into the Sony Street team. We used to go around putting up posters and stickers everywhere. We were vandalizing England, right? So putting up posters, stickers, and we had the opportunity to meet so many amazing people. So I remember having the opportunity to meet Lauryn Hill. So met Lauryn Hill, had a wonderful interview with her, and she was like oh, next time I come to England, I want this girl to interview me again. This was the best interview we'd done, right? I guess it's because everyone's like, you got your albums out, this, that, and the other. But I was asking questions, like I asked about Million Man March. I talked about things from a sort of like so-called feminist perspective, all of these various different things. And I was young, and I think she saw that. My friend was like, make sure you record the interview. I was like, okay, cool. I didn't record the interview, right? He was always like, make sure you take pictures of the people you meet and make sure you take their numbers, right? To this day, I look at Leakin and he has the pictures, he has the recordings, he has the numbers and the contacts and the communications. And this isn't about something about having proximity to fame or anything like that. But what for me that showed me was that he had the foresight to realize that the opportunity wasn't the meeting of the people. The opportunity was something bigger than that. And in many cases with Lee Khan, the opportunity was a relationship and a friendship and all of these different things, which I didn't see in a moment. And I realized oftentimes I don't see what the bigger opportunity is. So this is one of my biggest duas, and I'm talking and talking and talking. I forgot what the question was.
I also forgot what the question was. I'm just like listening and like the words are flowing over me. But I think this is also, I want to make the point you mentioned earlier about ADHD, and like I think a large number of us in this membership community are neurodiverse in some way or capacity. I completely recognize that habit, particularly of just being like really in the moment and just enjoying it and going with it. And that's what also, I'm sure, made you such an amazing interviewer to Lauryn Hill. I mean, like, come on, that's like a dream come true moment. And, of course, you're not going to be thinking about taking photos at that moment. But like a person who has that kind of marketing mentality, be like, okay, this is going to look good for my CV. I'm going to get evidence and I'm going to make it, perhaps they wouldn't have been so present in that interview.
True. Very true. Very true.
I do think, though, that like, yeah, it is something to think about, but also that can be something that someone else can think about. Like,
very true. Very true. Book publishing. I say all of that to say that I was like, okay, I'm just writing poetry. Even on my computer, I probably have hundreds of poems that I don't know where I wouldn't know. I'm sure if I was to check my Untitled, right? Or if I was to search Untitled, loads of poems will come up. If I was to go into my house and look at all of these books, notebooks, I'm sure there's probably like 15 collections in them,
You need to find you an intern, right? Or a VA or something.
Exactly. But so yeah, I was never writing for a collection. And then someone said to me, you should write a collection for just go work for a publishing company for our company. And I was like, okay, thinking she was just like, just BSing basically. So I was like, okay, if you say so. And then I'll just continue writing. And then after she was like, no, you should seriously think about it. And then another poet called Shagufta, I don't know if you know Shagufta, but she is a remarkable poet. And she was working for that company at the time as well. And she was like, no, you should seriously think about get some funding. And I didn't get any funding, but I did speak to someone about being like a mentor during that process. And Jacob Samuel Rose, he wasn't a specific mentor, but he definitely helped me, and he really challenged me to be like, if you wanted to, you can just gather all your old poems and put them in a collection and put them out, or you could write something for it. You could write with intention. You could be intentional about this being a collection about a particular thing, and you could do that. And so I decided to do that, and yeah, that's how I got it out. But I think there's definitely benefit in self-publishing. I would self-publish if I had the opportunity. But also, one thing that this taught me is that you could just ask people to publish you. You could just have a collection and go to people. Or what I think now, if I was to do things again or from scratch, I probably would have some ideas and I would look for an agent, because what I've realized is that a lot of agents don't want your collection finished. They want you to have part collections so they can be like, we nurtured this person. Do you know what I mean? So I think I would definitely, if I had a collection already, I would definitely try and put that out I would self-publish. I would also go to publishers and say, yo, would you publish this? I would go to agents. I would be more intentional about it, I think. But yeah, it worked out, alhamdulillah. And yeah, the benefit that I think of going through a publisher rather than self-publishing is that, unfortunately, the way how this poetry sort of like society is made up is that there are particular festivals that you won't be able to go to unless your book is published through someone. So like, even if you set up your own publishing company, and then I think there's a group of small publishers who they group together to have a distribution deal, and they get distributed by this particular company. I don't remember the name of it. If I remember, I'll send it to you, Medina. And but that allows people to get onto particular festivals. But now that I have a collection that is published by Ben and I Books, which is based in Bristol, and Ben and I are always looking for artists. A few Muslim poets have been published on there, you know, but like I would definitely now be like, okay, yes, I'm going to a festival and I've got this book and my self-published book. So yeah, multiple ways.
Yeah, I think that's really amazing advice, actually, because that's been a kind of a dilemma that's come up a lot for our writers, is like, do we self-publish? Especially if you're a Muslim writing. We haven't really talked very much about kind of like the Muslim aspect of being a writer, but I just think this is such valuable information that you're sharing. Thank you so much. And yeah, and that thing of like having something, it feels a little bit sort of tiresome in a way, like to have this kind of establishment that's like, oh, you have to do it our way, and we will choose the things that we like about, and yeah, and so like there's lots of Muslim poets, like quite well-known poets, who've self-published and they've done really well with it. I mean, Baraka Blue's last book, he had like a limited edition leather-bound version, and he had like maybe like gold embossed, and he sold them for like, they were like $400-500 or something. They were really like, you know, and he fundraised the whole thing. So people can do it. You can go down that way. But that's really, really important to know, that like, if you do it through the sort of traditional model, that you will have these opportunities. And inshallah, what we want to do is to build those opportunities as well. It's like, you know, like you were talking about the trajectory as well, like to end up being a trustee in this organization and become a lecturer and this and that. Yeah, I mean, we can build that as well for ourselves. Like, one thing that we've always wanted to do with the Muslim Writers Salon is provide those kinds of opportunities for people who haven't been able to find them elsewhere, you know, like you're very talented, but like your material is very religious, or maybe not very religious, but it's just like it expresses a lot of spirituality. Some people find that a little bit uncomfortable, and so it hasn't fitted somewhere before. But, you know, like also the MFA program, like we've, you know, Ambata's told us about like being on an MFA and people just kind of being like, oh, your writing needs to be more universal, or I don't know, like we need to also create those spaces, I think. So I'm really excited to work with you more, Muneera, inshallah.
Inshallah, I mean, dear Allah, please keep this girl being persistent, and please help me to be more organized.
I mean, persistent, because I'm also like always falling off the wagon and forgetting what I'm going to be doing, and like, oh, but I've got so many ideas and plans, and I also want to make a poetry competition. Haven't talked about, but through the Ecstatic Exchange, because like I have that is a publishing company, although it is like a very small one. But like, you know, I've gone through that whole process of figuring out how to publish through Ingram Spark, and the quality of it is pretty nice. And I really don't think that there is a poetry competition that like caters to that particular type of, like, you could say Sufi poetry, or just like Muslim like ecstatic poetry. So that's something that, inshallah, you know, I'll be in touch. I'll get my people to talk to your people. Okay, last words. Do you have advice? What advice would you give to up and coming writers?
I think my advice to up and coming writers is really corny and cheesy, but just to love, man, just to love God, love yourself, love the fact that you are a poet. It is such an honor to just be someone who's able to witness the world and then put that into words, and for that to connect with people. James Baldwin, one of the quotes that I love, and it wasn't just about poets, but he said, I'm paraphrasing, I'm messing up his quotes, so please just ignore. But he was just saying that he's come to realize that the only ones left who knows the truth are the poets, you know? And it's like there is something that has existed since the dawn of time. Poetry has existed since the dawn of time. People have been able to communicate and found ways to preserve their lineage, to preserve their stories, to preserve so many different things. We know things about the world based on the poetry of philosophers, the poetry of like so many different people that has just managed to stick with us. There are truths that are conveyed in conversations that don't go anywhere, but those truths in poetry, or even our interpretation of those truths, connect. So it's a real honor. And I think really it takes a lot of love, it's a labor of love. And in that process, I've learned to love myself more. And in loving myself more, I've learned to love my creator more. I've learned to love humankind more. I've learned to love so many different things. And I think like oftentimes, even if it feels aggressive, or even if it feels, you know, like it's not a love poem, I feel like things should be rooted in love. We should root everything in love. And I don't mean in a hippy dippy type of love, even though that is cool too at sometimes. But like if we use that navigation of love, then we will always is a great compass essentially. So I would say root things in love, really.
MashaAllah. Those are such beautiful words from such a beautiful person. And I love you, Muneera.
I love you too.
I love you. Why does it I have to put an American accent for this kinds of
my American friends always tell me, my American friend said that is not an American accent, but I know that you're trying to do it.
And I don't know whether to be offended or flattered. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you so much, Muneera. This has been beautiful.
De nada.
Thank you all so much for being here and your amazing reactions and comments. And we'll be seeing more of Muneera, obviously.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Sending love and salams to you all.